Good morning. The committee will come to order. Welcome, and thank all of you all for joining us today at the full committee hearing examining the implementation of the Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017. Last year's enactment of this bipartisan legislation was a culmination of years of work by members of this committee, and I believe is also one of the most consequential reforms to the federal civil service system in decades. This law was put in place to provide the Secretary the tools he or she needs to protect whistleblowers and hold poor-performing employees accountable. I've said time and time again that the vast majority of VA employees are good, hardworking men and women who take the VA's core mission to heart. But before this law, the bad actions of a few tainted the good names of many for far too long. The drafting of this legislation did not happen in a vacuum. Ideas to improve the legislation were received from all corners to include federal employee unions. It was not an ideological or partisan attack on federal workers. In fact, the final negotiated package passed the U.S. Senate by voice vote, the full House by a vote of 368 to 55, including 23 of the 24 members of this committee and 137 Democrats, and was supported by 18 veteran service organizations. While I'm proud they were able to come together and craft this important legislation, our role in overseeing the law's implementation is equally important, and that's why we're here today. The only way to bring true accountability to VA is to create a culture where employees want to come to work and serve veterans. This will only happen when good work is consistently rewarded and when it's clear the department won't tolerate employees who do not live up to the high standards required of public service. We all remember the stories of poor performance and misconduct this committee and others uncovered about a select few VA employees who had refused to or were incapable of adhering to these high standards. We found time and time again that civil service laws make it extremely difficult and time-consuming to hold an employee accountable who didn't share VA's values, even in instances where the employee in question had broken the law. I think every one of us on this dais can agree that this is unacceptable and that our veterans deserve better. So today, we're here to discuss how VA is moving toward this goal of sustainable accountability and efforts to educate employees and managers about this new authority. I also want to make it clear that while this law made it easier to discipline poor employees, it did not give VA the license to use this authority to target employees, no matter their position or grade, or to retaliate against whistleblowers. The department and this committee continue to rely on whistleblowers to come forward and shed the light on waste, fraud, and abuse throughout VA. And I hope to learn more about how implementation of this law is or is not protecting these courageous employees. We can't measure success of this law's implementation against a number of disciplinary actions, but we can measure failure. And if one single man or woman is afraid to come forward to report wrongdoing because of fear of retaliation, to me, that would be a failure. Before I recognize Ranking Member Takano, I do want to briefly touch on the operations of the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, or OAWP. When we were negotiating the law that created this office, there were concerns expressed about creating yet another office at the VA that could duplicate efforts of other offices, when what we really needed to do was empower managers to make the right decisions and hold them accountable when they failed to do so. While the employees and management of OAWP should be lauded for their efforts to improve accountability within the VA, I am concerned that OAWP seeks to expand its role beyond what Congress intended. Particularly, I'm concerned by some of the recommendations that the VA submitted to Congress as part of its June 30th annual report and about the growth of this new office, and I look forward to addressing those concerns today. The goal of this new authority was to provide the Secretary a tool in their toolbox to discipline poor employees. And I'm worried that if we are not careful, the OAWP may turn into an entirely new toolbox. We must ensure this doesn't happen. Also, I am certainly no fan of red tape or bureaucracy. I am concerned about the apparent lack of formal written policies or procedures for operations at OAWP. Formal policies and procedures would promote consistent OAWP decisions and inspire confidence in their worth and work product. I also remain concerned about the ongoing conflict between Mr. O'Rourke and the Inspector General over the IG's access to OAWP's database of complaints. Mr. O'Rourke, hope that you and Mr. Massal have found a way to put this unnecessary distraction behind us, and I understand that you have. Finally, I want to reiterate this committee will not shy away from our oversight role to investigate improper usage and implementation of this law. However, the only way to do so is to continue this committee's bipartisan tradition to examine issues with statistics and facts and not with innuendo, anecdotal accounts, or partisan agendas. Now I'll yield to Ranking Member Tucano for any opening statements that he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling this important hearing. When the Accountability Act passed last summer, I voted for it with a great deal of caution. I was cautiously optimistic that it would do what it set out to do, which was to provide care by making it, to improve care, by making it easier to remove bad employees. I understood that the connection between dismissing bad employees and improved care was superficial, but the bill was the best of several legislative attempts to address the VA's significant issues in its management of human resources. I did vote against several of those legislative attempts because I felt that there were just too many bad things in those bills. But I voted for this bill because I hoped that the VA would take the tools we were providing so that they could not only address bad employees, but also protect good employees by improving the agency's overall human resources functions and morale. But now that we are more than a year out, I have real concerns about how the VA is using the tools that Congress provided in the Accountability Act. Of the 1,096 removals during the first 5 months of 2018, the majority of those fired were housekeeping aides. This has no doubt contributed to the fact that there are currently over a dozen medical centers with housekeeping vacancies. I have seen firsthand the problems caused by vacancies in housekeeping staff at the Loma Linda University Medical Center near my district, and I see how that directly impacts care for veterans. I also find it hard to believe that there are large numbers of housekeeping aides whose performance is so poor that it cannot be addressed. If that is truly the case, then it stands to reason that there are also management issues behind their poor performance. But of those 1,096 removals, only 15 were supervisors, which is less than 1.4%. Firing rank and file employees does nothing to resolve persistent management issues. Instead, it just leads to worse care from unnecessary vacancies. This type of implementation is not the intent of the Accountability Act, and I hope everyone on this committee can agree that it is not possible to fire your way to excellence. In fact, this was a view that was shared by the Commission on Care's findings, which also found that the VA's human resources management was understaffed and under-resourced. This led to problems with poor hiring practices and poor workplace culture. This further exacerbated the VA's difficulties in hiring the best and the brightest, and therefore creating a vicious cycle. The Accountability Act was supposed to be the VA's tool to break this vicious cycle, but in the past year we have heard indications that VA's human resources management is in more disarray than ever. A high turnover rate is never a good sign of good management, and good management starts at the top. For months, we have seen a steady stream of reports in the press of a hostile work environment in the VA's Human Resources Division, previously led by Peter Shelby. Then, just last week, it was reported that Mr. Shelby himself was fired. Although the VA released a statement saying that he left to pursue other opportunities, and whether any of those reports are true, the damage to VA's HR management has already been done. I am not sure how the VA is supposed to improve its human resources management when such stories of its toxic environment are rampant. And finally, it is in the midst of this turmoil that this administration released a new executive order that limits the amount of official time for employees to no more than 25%. As we all know, official time is not spent on union activities. Let me repeat that. Official time is not spent on union activities because spending time on union activities is illegal. Rather, it is time spent by union officials to perform human resources functions and ensure a well-functioning work environment for all VA employees. With the current turmoil and vacancies in the VA's HR division, the human resources function that employees on official time perform is more important than ever in ensuring that care for veterans is not impacted. For the VA to sustain cuts to essential human resources functions from both ends like this does not inspire confidence that performance is improving at the agency. The goal of the Accountability Act was not to further undercut the already strained VA workforce. Firing cannot replace good management. I hope our discussion today will shed more light on what the VA is doing in its implementation of the Accountability Act to ensure better performance among its employees through better management. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to their testimony.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. On our first panel today, we welcome back Mr. Peter Roark, Acting Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. And Mr. Roark and I have spent the weekend in Reno with the Disabled American Veterans. Had a great convention out there. I thought it was, we spent a couple of hours on a panel together, and I thought it was time well spent. Mr. Roark is accompanied by Mr. Kirk Nicholas, the Acting Executive Director of the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, and Mr. Nathan Manley, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Human Resources and Administration. Mr. Roark, you're now recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Takano, distinguished members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here with Nathan Manley, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Human Resources Administration, and Kirk Nicholas, Executive Director of the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection. Let me get right to the point. Retaliation against employees who identify a legitimate problem or report that there may be a violation of law, rule, or regulation is absolutely unacceptable. I will not tolerate it. Protecting employees from retaliation is a moral obligation of VA leaders, a statutory obligation, and a priority for this department. We will take prompt action to hold accountable those individuals engaged in whistleblower retaliation, and that includes appropriate disciplinary action. I'm confident that the overwhelming majority of our employees are here to do the right thing. Our best employees own accountability because they are here to make a positive difference in the lives of veterans. Congress and VA leadership spent years creating the right formula for addressing accountability, and it's why we're talking today. The problems that surfaced at VA in 2014 uncovered serious shortfalls in the way some leaders dealt with employees who made disclosures. Those problems led to the establishment of the Interdisciplinary Crisis Response Team in July of that year and expanded into the Office of Accountability Review. The purpose was to improve transparency and elevate the visibility of senior leadership misconduct and their investigations. Those initial efforts shaped a new cultural direction for VA. This is why Congress passed and the President signed the Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act. The President and Congress ensured we had the right system and processes in place to protect employees who raise concerns and expose problems or issues, and to also hold accountable those who engage in misconduct. The President's executive order and Congress's legislative work in 2017 established OAWP, creating a new paradigm for accountability and whistleblower protection. So, how can we promote accountability and improve performance? We must change VA's culture from within. That change must be encouraged and sustained by leaders who embrace accountability and focus on productive workplace that empowers their employees. I own the responsibility of that change that is needed to move VA forward, but let me be clear. Making enduring cultural and process changes in an organization the size of VA takes time, persistence, and patience. Getting the processes, communication, and relationships right will not be easy, but my goal is to ensure that we have a better system in place, one that works for all employees. You've tasked the office with developing a system that better supports employees when they raise issues in the workplace. That task is really threefold. First, protect employees from retaliation, emphasize the need for greater transparency, and promptly investigate and resolve allegations of misconduct. Simply put, our policies must be aligned at every level to reflect the open and transparent way VA strives to operate. I've seen from the initial results, as evidenced in the report submitted to you last month, that this new office is making a difference and will continue to build on this foundation in the coming years. Let me highlight a few of our accomplishments in the past year. The office averages 170 employee whistleblower disclosures to that office a month, in which OAWP staff quickly examine the concerns in an effort to develop the issue raised. From June 23, 2017 to June 1, 2018, the triage staff assessed nearly 2,000 submissions of alleged wrongdoing. The Advisory and Analysis Division completed 182 cases. The same office recommended disciplinary or adverse actions in 54 of those cases involving 58 unique persons of interest. And let me remind you, this is only in the first year. While our work is just beginning, I am confident those numbers will change as we continue to promote accountability, improve performance, and change the culture of VA. We are all after the same ultimate objective, to do what's right for our veterans by providing the high-quality care, services, and benefits they've earned and they deserve. We can achieve that shared objective through cultural change and collective responsibility. Veterans and the American people expect us to work together on their behalf. We look forward to doing so, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'll start the questioning. And you mentioned, Mr. Roark, that 58 people had some disciplinary action. Is that correct? Out of 360,000+ employees?
Yes, sir. That's at the senior leader level.
At the senior level. Okay. Do you believe that the implementation of this law has been successful? Do you think this, and when I say that, per your comment this weekend about how the impact it has on managing this organization, and what are the three top metrics that you use to define success?
At the initial stand-up of the office, the first thing that you try to work through is just the recognition of what the new capability is, what we're trying to do, and communicating that across, in the case of OAWP, the senior leadership workforce, senior executives, folks in a confidential or policy-making position. That is difficult in an organization the size and scope of VA. Getting out to visit with VISNs, getting out to visit with medical center directors, and teaching them, helping them understand what the purpose of that office is in a context of we're here to possibly investigate your misconduct or your performance is a tightrope to walk. But I believe we did that pretty successfully by going into non-threatening environments with them, also with meeting with the unions and groups, training everyone that would take our call to reach out to them to answer any questions they would have.
Well, how do you answer? Because I've read some of the whistleblower in here who feel like they've been retaliated against. How do you hold it? And I'm not saying that what they've said is true or not true, but I read this last night on several letters that are submitted for the record. How do you adjudicate them when they say they're locked in a put in an office to do nothing for a year, 15 months, 16 months, whatever? How do you make them whole in that case?
First is listening to the whistleblower. What we found very quickly was that a lot of the folks that came to us initially that had things to say, whether they were a legitimate whistleblower complaint was really a matter of defining and making sure they understand what that definition was. But regardless of the definition, it was listening to them and making sure their voice was heard, and then doing the investigation or going on site to actually see what they were claiming and having either a discussion with their supervisors or with the leadership of that organization to determine what was really going on. A lot of times what we found, it was really just two sides not talking to each other. In times we could facilitate that conversation. Other times it had been too long, so we needed to take other action, whether that meant a full-blown investigation of the matter or referring that off to OSC or OIG.
Because I think if you don't protect the whistleblowers, this will fail. I think they have to feel like that you can step forward and say something and not be retaliated against, because that's a huge deterrent to finding out what's going on in an organization as large as the VA. Absolutely,
and getting that word out and changing that cultural piece is going to take some time because there are places that are more difficult than others. The one thing, though, that you provided in this bill was what we call anecdotally the 714 hold. That wasn't something that had existed before, and what that meant is employees GS-15 and below that had an action that they might feel is retaliatory, we were able to step in as the office, as the director, and I can tell and stop that action, put a hold on that action, not allowing it to move forward until whether it was the Office of Accountability or the Office of Special Counsel could then investigate that disclosure for its substance, whether it was real or not. But during that period of time, that employee could not be affected, whether it was retaliatory or not.
How do you respond to the charges that the law unfairly is targeting lower-level employees, many of whom are veterans?
I've got specifics that I'm going to let Mr. Manley address specifically, but it's in the data. The 218 report that was a requirement of the law as we put through, and as we looked at this, when we look back to 2014 and forward, you don't see a significant difference from year to year, frankly, in any category of unrealistic firings or removals of any category of employee, let alone focusing on lower-level employees. And Mr. Manley's got a few more details on that, too.
Certainly. So we took a look specifically at custodial workers, laundry workers, and food service workers, and looked across the past 3 fiscal years. And what we're seeing is not a significant change in the number of actions we've taken. From a percentage perspective, less than a 1% increase in the number of terminations of that level of employee. Now, granted, those 3 occupations are the highest occupation within the Veterans Health Organization for terminations. And that's the nature of the work that compares similarly to the private sector.
My time has expired. Mr. Takano, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roark, I understand that the VA has provided the Office of the Inspector General access to OAWP information this morning, and that they are entitled, the information that they are entitled to under the Inspector General Act. Can I get your commitment today that you will provide and continue to provide to the OIG full, complete, and prompt access to OAWP records and all other requests made by the OIG?
Has been complied with, even before this morning's recent access to a SharePoint site. Yes,
and I want to know if you are committed to that you will continue to provide the OIG full, complete, and prompt access to OAWP records and all of their requests. I realize that you complied with its previous requests, and I know that there was a very public spat over that. I want to just get your commitment today that you will comply with future OIG requests.
It's unfortunate that that has been such a public about one issue, because this has been, his access to OAWP has been unfettered since day one.
That's not what played out, and so I just want to get your commitment that you will comply with future OIG requests.
My commitment remains the same as it's been since day one, to provide the IG access.
I'm not interested in day one what you claim to have said. I want to know from this day forward, will you comply with the OIG?
Yes.
Thank you. I am concerned that of the 1,096 removals during the first 5 months of this year, less than 1.4% were supervisors, and that the majority of them were housekeeping aides. And let me just put this in perspective. There has always been a preference requirement for this job category, veterans preference requirement, and also hiring under non-competitive set-asides for veterans in this job category. So in the past, the vast majority, close to 100% of employees at the VA in this category have been disabled veterans. And that can vary somewhat by facility, but my impression is that in this category, because of these set-asides, the vast majority of these workers tend to be veterans, disabled veterans. Would you agree with that assessment?
No, sir, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
Not disabled veterans. That is a veteran's preference that they have. That's all veterans.
Okay, so it's all veterans, but whether it's disabled veterans and veterans, this tends to be a very veteran-dominated job category. Mm-hmm. Okay, and let's be clear that this is who we have, the majority of the 1,096 employees who have been removed, majority of them have come from the housekeeping category, and we're talking veterans here. Not 1/3, but in this category, 1/3 of all veterans 1/3 of all employees of the VA tend to be veterans, but in this job category, nearly 100%. As I mentioned in my opening statement, if there are so many housekeeping aides with incurable poor performance, it is likely that there are some management issues there as well. What are you doing to ensure that personnel decisions such as adverse actions are truly addressing care issues and not just unnecessarily creating vacancies at lower levels while the real culprits of institutional problems remain on the job?
I think it's helpful to be clear about the turnover rate at that housekeeper level. Regardless whether they're veterans or not. That is, like Mr. Manley already mentioned, that is our highest turnover area, regardless of whether this is in the VA or outside the VA. In fact, our turnover rates in that area are much lower than the private sector, which is closer to 200%.
Yeah, but you're shifting the locus of our conversation here. We're talking about people who've been removed. We're not talking about turnovers. How is that relevant to what my questions are talking about?
The turnover rate includes removals.
There again, you're going on to a different talking point about turnovers. We're talking about removals here. And that implies to me some management issues.
Even removals, sir, if you go back to 2014, there's not a dramatic difference from the new accountability law than there was beforehand, which indicates year over year.
We're talking about the first 5 months, about all these removals.
Sir, if you go back to 2014, you're going to see the same amount of removals even before the accountability law.
Well, this still gets to this issue of who we're removing and whether or not we're addressing bad management, unskilled management, what we're doing to improve the personnel function, and the fact that the personnel function of the VA is also in turmoil.
I don't connect those two, sir. I'm going to stay focused on the removals or the turnover rate, both of the lower,
anyway,
lower skilled employees.
What are you doing to ensure that these crucial positions, such as those, I guess my time has run out, so I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yielding, Mr. Kaufman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the Acting Secretary, I first want to thank you so much for your responding to a concern that was raised by a whistleblower in Denver, Colorado, that led to, within the VA OIG, and that pulling it to a higher level to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. I want to thank you for being so responsive to that. Let me raise an issue of accountability. And I guess this is different than what Mr. Takano has raised, in that I'm concerned that, and if you could relay this as well to the incoming secretary, that at this SCS Senior Executive Service Management level, that we have had individuals in these positions who have had multiple negative reports, either by GAO or VA OIG, that have never been cleaned up. And yet these people are allowed to remain there. And so specifically, we are going to be opening a VA hospital in Aurora, Colorado this Saturday. And the individual that was responsible for the last person there in charge of the project from the VA standpoint in terms of construction management, that ultimately led to $1 billion in cost overruns, a project that was 5 years behind schedule, that I led the fight in the Congress to replace the VA construction management team with the Army Corps of Engineers. Without that, I don't think this project ever would have been built. Congress never would have had the confidence to fund those cost overruns to complete this hospital. And in fact, under her leadership, Congress, stripped the VA of its construction management authority ever to build a hospital again. And yet, this person is still there in charge of VA construction facilities management. Not only was she still there, your predecessor, Secretary Shulkin, actually tried to promote her to being in charge of facilities management and contracting. That she, at my behest, or certainly I raised the issue about her competence, and she was put back down in charge of construction management. I mean, if we don't clean house, no matter what the new VA secretary says or does, at this level, at this SES level, nothing will change. And so that's my concern. And do you have a response to that?
Well, sir, I think the response would be to point out the one, as you described me, it is a very difficult challenge when you're looking at changing the culture of an organization this size and as intricately designed, I guess, at this point. As we look at how to restructure and bring things like construction management and other things into better alignment with our priorities, with our goals, with serving veterans, that will hopefully lead to some better management structure, but really what the accountability law does for us in that regard, by adding accountability and putting performance as part of that, that was new, that was innovative at a degree that I don't think we all give ourselves credit enough for. That's going to allow us in the future, once we get over this, get the accountability side correct, and start adding carefully the performance side, because that is something we have to be very cognizant of, just as the ranking member mentioned. When we talk about managers and how they manage and what their performance is, we have to do that very, very carefully so that we're not unfair. But that is something we have to address, and I think that's going to start to address some of those systemic issues you see.
I think you have around 400, I think, in the Department of Veterans Affairs at this SCS level who run the data, who are just below the political appointees, who run the day-to-day operations within and programs within the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I think you've got to, I would hope that the new secretary would take a look across the board and where we've had consistent failure, those people simply have to be removed. And the Congress of the United States, on a bipartisan basis, has given the Department of Veterans Affairs the authority to more expeditiously remove these managers who are at the top of this bureaucracy. And so I just want to commend you to talk to the new secretary to move forward with cleaning house.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen. If you'll, Ms. Esty, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding today's important meeting. When Congress passed the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, it was a recognition that more accountability was needed at the VA, and you're hearing that from everyone here today. However, accountability doesn't just mean increasing the number of VA employees who are pushed out the door. Accountability means, as Mr. Roark, as you had noted, creating real change in culture and ensuring that bad behavior is not repeated. Management that has enabled bad behavior needs to be held accountable, just as much as low-level employees who, in some cases, may not have been properly trained. For Acting Secretary Roark, during your tenure, our committee has been made aware of a significant number of career employees who have had served under multiple secretaries. These employees have been removed, demoted, or reassigned, or they've resigned or retired after being made aware of adverse actions coming their way. It's concerning because there are a large number of personnel changes, and that brings about instability in managing such a large agency. Can you tell us now how many such personnel changes you're aware of for the Office of the Secretary personnel, including Executive Secretary, Protocol Office, Centers for Women and Minority Veterans, and other included staff in the time between May 30th and July 16th? And if not, if someone cannot answer that today.
I'm trying to make sure I can address, I know I can address two of those. The Center for Women's Veterans, I believe the director there resigned last week and is now working at CNAS, Center for National Security. I believe she started on Monday. So it appeared she had moved on to better things. The Executive Secretary, we recognized that we needed to make some changes at the Office of the Secretary level. That required us to move some people. They weren't demoted or resigned, or they just moved to other, one in particular moved to another SES job, the other moved to another GS-15 job. So we're not on a path to just move things randomly. These are all very well planned and designed moves to better make efficiency and effectiveness at our level. But this is something we're encouraging leadership to do across the board. Just as Mr. Kaufman pointed out, if you've had issues with your performance or your organization's performance, do not hesitate to take action. whether that's from misconduct or that's from just restructuring to get better performance to serve veterans. That's.
Can you clarify then, were these for cause, for performance issues, or you're saying efficiency? I mean, that
this
can
is
cover a
organizational.
multitude of things.
Sorry, it's for organizational efficiency. I mean, we're talking about when you have an office that's not performing the way it needs to. That doesn't always mean that a person was committing misconduct of some sort. This means that we're not getting the performance or the efficiency out of that organization that we need, and then sometimes it requires a change in leadership.
All right, well, I'm sure we are going to be revisiting this issue to see in 6 months, you know, what are we seeing, and to be clear about what is it that's not performance. How
Absolutely.
are you measuring that performance, and what are you doing to ensure that there's better performance, setting out clear metrics, setting out training, and being very transparent about what that is. Because there's a lot of concern, and we are hearing a lot of back channel about morale impacts of this, and when you lose a lot of senior people, that's a lot of institutional knowledge. That happening all at once during a time of an acting secretaryship is very destabilizing. We have major pieces of legislation, major changes, and to be clearing out that many people is of concern about an ability to actually effectuate change when you have people who are no longer going to be there who have the institutional knowledge. You've addressed, so you're saying none were for cause? Of
those two that I just mentioned, neither of them were any action taken, so we're not talking about something that would be for cause or not.
Are you communicating with nominee Wilkie about any of these changes?
No.
Do you intend to do that? Because it's going to be important for him coming in to understand, if confirmed, about what the reasons are for these changes and what you're attempting to achieve. That's our oversight role, is to do that.
Sure.
And we are not being aware. So I would like you to follow up with us. What were the reasons for these changes? Why have they been moved? Where they've moved on these major positions? And frankly, we're going to have to look with back channel of what we are hearing with perhaps different reasons than you are suggesting here today about the rationale for these changes. It's of concern.
It's
concern about politicizing these high-level positions, and that's of deep concern.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch to politicize?
If there's any question about whether these are loyalty concerns or other implications about why these people are being replaced, that's of deep concern. There's no place for politics in this agency, and people need to be held to performance standards. And again, when people have served under multiple secretaries, if it's a performance issue, we should be made aware, and so should the incoming nominee be made aware what those issues are.
Absolutely.
And we should, to do our oversight role. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. And Mr. Boss, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roark, a number of VA employees in my district have reached out to me, and they believe issues within the VA would qualify them as whistleblowers. How has the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection training employees about the correct way to handle the whistleblower disclosure in compliance with the law? What do you actually, how do you train them?
How do we train them? So there's been ongoing training or awareness, provided posting of signs, those things from OIG, the Office of Special Counsel. So there are requirements by statute to post what is a disclosure and what do you do to post or to submit a disclosure to those two agencies. The Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection being new, we had to go educate folks of what we needed. By statute, we were required to produce an identifying and non-identifying form and a toll-free number that is completely anonymous. Those were both done within the first few weeks of the office being developed, and we continue to refine those. But those are available to all employees in multiple different ways. We also have the website that we keep updated that describes very clearly what is a disclosure to help them. But we really understood that what we had to do, just as I mentioned earlier, is listen to employees and let them talk about what their issues are. A lot of times when they feel that they can't talk to their management or supervisors, they do need somebody to talk to. And a lot of the cases we found from deep diving to some older cases, that was what caused a lot of this to fester and grow and then become much bigger of an issue unless we addressed it at the site. So we've done a lot in that area. We have more to do. We've trained, I believe, 40,000, I'm sorry, you have those specific numbers.
I do. So we've trained 2,000 HR professionals and attorneys on the Accountability Act. We've also trained 40,000 supervisors, and we've specifically from the Senior Executive Service, 690 members are trained there as well.
So then I'll ask this, so when somebody does come forward, who is it that actually goes to them Is it someone that has been trained from your office? Is it someone that is at the site where they're at? Or how is that handled?
If they reach out to us, I mean, so you have to remember, they have multiple channels. They have the Congress, they have the Office of Inspector General, they have the Office of Special Counsel. They can go down any one of those paths to make their disclosure, and they're all equally legitimate. If they come to us either through the form or through the hotline, or toll-free number, I don't want to call it a hotline, confused with OIG, then part of our triage folks will talk to them if they reach out to us, and if they just submit the form, then we reach out to them to fully develop what their disclosure is and give them some sort of sense of what it is, is what they're claiming a disclosure, is it retaliation? We handhold them through that process because we found that that's the most effective to addressing that at the lowest level.
Okay, I'm going to go just shift on my other question here a little bit. Prior to the hearing, the committee requested copies of written policies and handbooks and directives and regulations that have been sent out and putting things in place. And what they received, they thought were lacking, to say the least. Is there intent for a larger, more in-depth written policy to be put together so that when someone from our offices requests, okay, what's your checklist, how you doing it, and how do we know what you're doing is going to be right not only for the whistleblower, but right for the agency?
Sure. I'll take the criticism of that. Early on, we had a bias toward action to actually start reaching out to folks and working with whistleblowers. We had quite a bit of legacy, whether it was senior leader misconduct cases or just a backlog of whistleblowers that wanted to reach out to us. So we did focus a lot more on the operational side, and so we are now trying to see what we've learned from a process standpoint and start to codify that. Okay. So we do have work to do on creating actual regulations around what we do. We do have pretty in-depth process maps, which we're sitting down with the OIG at this time to go over so that they can see how we handle disclosures, which is interesting because we both have a similar mission. But that is more work that we have to do.
You mentioned earlier in your testimony, you were talking about I think you said it was 714 hold, is that correct? Yes, sir. Exactly how does that work and how does that get implemented?
When a whistleblower is served an action, is basically they're given a proposed adverse action of some sort. If they have previously disclosed to the Office of Special Counsel, the Office of Inspector General, although that one's a little more complicated based on the transparency there, or to the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, we then will reach out to that supervisor or that proposing official and say, you will hold this action until you hear from us. Okay. And so they cannot move forward with that action, and we work with human resource. So
and that action could be, my time's expired, but just
adverse actions, removal, demotion, suspension. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I certainly agree with some of your opening comments in terms of change in culture within the VA, and many have already spoken to that. And I certainly concur with your perspective that changing culture takes time and persistence and patience. It's not easy to change a culture in a very large organization. But we also know that the VA is only as good as the employees who work within it. And I would say too that the preceding secretaries, changing culture has been one of their, top priorities without question. But we continue, and I am concerned that we still get negative reporting around the morale within the agency, and that the morale is not very good. And so my first question would be, since the Accountability Act was instituted within the VA, do you think employee morale has increased or decreased since the Accountability Bill or Act has been applied?
Anecdotally, where I visit on trips, I see high morale, but I'm not saying that to counter yours. But I think best what we'll know is from our all-employee survey, which I'm going to let Mr. Manley speak to, of when we're going to have those results and how that process of getting those results back, and we'll definitely most share them with you all.
Certainly. So as you know, we conduct an all-employee survey every year. That survey goes out to every employee across the VA and gives them an opportunity to tell us how their morale is, how things are going in their organization. So this year's all-employee survey closed on June 25th, and our commitment is to have those results ready to go 45 days after it's closed. So mid-August, we'll have those results ready to go, and I'm already on the hook to come back and brief this committee, I believe, on those results and what we found as a result of the survey.
In the previous morale survey, what were the results of that?
So if you use the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey and the Partnership for Public Service, VA was down the list of places to work. And so we'll be comparing this year's results to those previous results to see how we've done.
Thank you. Mr. Roark, who will be leading the VA's personnel department now that we have the vacancy?
Sure. Right now, officially, but the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Nathan Manley, is leading that office.
And what is your assessment of the current leadership there, and what's your plan to ensure that the office remains fully functional and able to meet the needs of the agency despite these recent departures?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a point to that is I don't think any office across the federal government is dependent on one person. They're very important at the leadership, but have full confidence in the leadership team that's at HRNA today. We'll be working with them on what our expectations are going forward. But their role is very complex. I mean, as you know, I mean, we have the HR function throughout the Veterans Health Administration and the Veterans Benefit Administration. These are massive organizations across the entire 50 United States, territories, foreign countries. They have a huge challenge, and we'll be working with them to make sure that they have everything that they need to continue the progress that we've already made. So we look forward to that.
Well, from my perspective, I think the HR department has been a very weak spot across the VA, and if they're not working efficiently and filling vacancies, then other departments are not operating at full capacity and performance, and so it's a constant issue that we have debated and discussed many, many times here in the committee. And so being able to actually fill these vacancies in a timely manner with high-quality people is really important. So I do see it as it's the weakest link in the system, and really we need to be focused on it very much so. And so that just goes to, again, my question around your plan and what your personal involvement will be to make sure that this department is operating as effectively as possible.
Along with my own personal involvement, I've tasked the Chief of Staff to be personally involved in this as well. So we're taking this leadership involvement at a very serious level.
Well, my time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. Dr. Dunn, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank
you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Roark, for coming here to review the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act 1 year in. So in recent months, there have been some articles around the country regarding a number of VA physicians who were whistleblowers, had made legitimate complaints, and they reported this, allegations of isolation, limiting access to their computers, bullying, intimidation, and actual threats against their medical licenses, so false claims to the medical boards that would impair their license. In fact, there was a case of a VA physician who reported overprescribing, inappropriate use of opioids, and after reporting those problems, she had her practice privileges suspended and had false allegations made to her medical board. These are chilling things for your physicians to hear, both the ones you employ and the prospective ones you might employ. How does the VA protect these physician whistleblowers?
First, we take every one of those claims very seriously. When those are claims of retaliation of that nature are made to the office, they're immediately addressed through the triage process to develop those further. I can tell you in most of my experience with those cases, there's a lot more to the story. So we try to find all the story elements that we can and then make a determination very quickly of whether to refer that to the Office of Medical Inspector or if there's something more serious, other appropriate investigative agencies.
So I see a number in the data that was reading of 319 complaints in the last year of retaliation against whistleblowers. Do you think that's a correct number? You think that's fair?
I think in an organization like the VA that hasn't done what it should about defining what retaliation is, both from an educational standpoint, the simple education standpoint, but that really digging into that, using examples, and having every level of management hold each other accountable for that type of behavior. I have seen incredibly egregious examples of whistleblower retaliation, and I've seen claims of whistleblower retaliation that were absolutely not.
Not true.
And it was holding people
so
accountable.
What can, if someone does experience legitimate retaliation, so what action can the VA take against that employee who was retaliating against the whistleblower?
There's two forms that'll take it. If we in the department find that, then we will take adverse action against that supervisor, manager. It has to be in those categories because employee to employee.
Can you give me a for instance? I mean, that sounds like a pretty bad thing to do.
We've removed.
They fired.
Yeah, we've removed individuals for that, usually after the second type of requirement. The Office of Special Counsel, their mandatory sentence, if you want to call it, is I believe it's 14 days or more suspension in the first instance of whistleblower retaliation.
Is it important to protect the anonymity of these whistleblowers so that their identity is not?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a key concern on the front end. If somebody does come to your office with a legitimate complaint about opioid overprescription or something, that they don't, this is not then public knowledge that they made that complaint, lest they experience these kind of retaliations.
It's the single highest reason given for retaliation is that they were a whistleblower. There's other claims of retaliation that have to do with other types of activity, but that's been the single highest.
So that's protecting the witness, if you will.
Yes.
Witness protection program. Gosh, what are we doing now? So let me change, with a minute left to me here. The GAO report last year found when it came to official time, this time when employees are working, they're doing actually union duties, but they're on the VA payroll, they found that's supposed to be reported. We're supposed to know how much that time is. They go through a process. But that data we think is inconsistent, unreliable. So you have a new system, the VATOS, VA Time and Attendance System. You have faith in that? Is that system going to give us some real data, honest data?
Yes, sir. We're going to start fully recording everyone's time, especially when it comes to official time, and that'll put about 472 employees back to work, 11 of those being psychologists and 62 being RN.
Some physicians, I guess, huh?
Yeah, so this will actually be able to help us manage not just what we talked about, giving folks credit for the official time that they need to use, but also putting folks back.
When will that system be rolled out across the VA?
Sorry?
When will it be, that system, the VATOS system?
So we are on the hook this month for deployment.
Excellent, excellent. Let me offer you my apology for the physicians who are goofing off. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank gentlemen for yielding. Ms. Custer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Roark, for coming to New Hampshire, to Manchester, and I appreciated our meeting and our conversation. I was left hopeful at the time, but unfortunately, my staff has yet to receive the final reports from either the Office of Medical Inspector or the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection. Just this past spring, the VA had informed us that these reports were in their final stages. So can you give me an update on the status of those reports about the Manchester VA and a timeline for their release?
I can't right now, but I will get that to you immediately after this meeting.
If you could, I know people in New Hampshire are anxious to hear about the investigations of the various personnel and the protections that the reason I supported this legislation was to give protections to our whistleblowers, but apparently something is holding up the final reports, and it's important for us to get to the bottom of this.
Yes.
I also want to take into account the situation in Bedford, Massachusetts, VA Medical Center next to my home district, which has been the center of at least 3 high-profile issues involving patient safety, employee safety, and gross fraud by employees. My colleagues in the Mass delegation and myself from New Hampshire felt that the Accountability Act that we're discussing today would have expedited effective and appropriate action. But it's my understanding that at least one of these employees central to the case is still on the job. She was accused of fraud and waste. Why was she not fired for shifting nearly $200,000 to her brother? And do you know the status of that case and what her current employment situation is?
So I want to be careful because I believe that still is in active investigation, but I am familiar with that. Do you have an update on where we're at? We've taken multiple disclosures from Bedford, and we actually spent 2 visits to be on the ground, taking interviewing potential whistleblowers or just variously other employees. But I know that that was also a OIG investigation as well, so we tried to make sure that we didn't cross into the criminal side. And I believe the facts that you're mentioning are on that criminal side of that. I think there was some resolution, though, with the individual's relative that was.
If you could get back to my office on that as well. And the other is that, again, in Bedford, a whistleblower recently had their allegations substantiated by the special counsel regarding asbestos contamination and subsequent patient and employee concerns about exposure. Can you tell us the status of that investigation?
I'll follow up with you, but it sounds like something that would go to the Office of Medical Inspector.
Okay. So essentially, let me just switch gears here. My time is limited. I've been disappointed by Assistant Secretary Shelby's response. We had a health subcommittee hearing in late June, and this is in regard to the March 2018 Merit Systems Protection Board study showing that the VA has the highest rate of sexual harassment across all federal agencies. His response was dismissive of that, and I'd like to hear directly from you. Do you accept the findings of this study? What are you doing about this issue? What role is the Office of the, the whistleblower protection involved in that? And what's the timeline for actions at the VA to address these allegations?
I'm going to get this all in 1 minute. So first, don't accept that kind of response. It's a serious issue, and to reiterate that, at the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, our standing policy was any claims, I don't care where they came from, any claims of any kind of sexual harassment or retaliation regarding that or anything required a 48-hour response from our office to have investigators on the ground, on site, to start those investigations. So we had no tolerance for any kind of delay in any of that. But I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Manley to provide the statistics on the training and some of the other parts of that program.
So we stood up a harassment prevention program in 2016. Over the past couple of months, we've been looking at what do we need to do to make that a more robust program. So is there additional training that we need to do so that employees are aware of what their avenues are for reporting? We have a strong policy. We have done recent updates to our handbook at the prompting of EEOC when they came in to look at our program. Although they liked what they saw, they did give us some suggestions, and so we're implementing those in our handbook. From a training perspective, we have a 95% training rate completion.
Is your training, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is it strictly online, or is it, is there an active component by the employees? Are they engaged with a trainer in a live interaction? So
the 95% training completion rate is for online training, and we've now begun to train the trainer program so we can start doing online or in-person training.
In-person. I think it's much more effective. That's certainly what we've learned here on Capitol Hill, and we've also tried to make changes. And I think the other thing is that knowing, I'm sorry, my time is up, but knowing that this is from the top down and that there's a policy of no tolerance. So I apologize to the chair, and I yield back.
I thank General Lady General Bergman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel here for being here today, because you know, there's always more than one way to skin a cat, but in this case, the cat is still the cat. And in this case, bad behavior is bad behavior. It can vary from embezzling money to poor patient care to you name it, the amount of different categories. But the reporting system, in this case, needs to be standardized, because if we don't have a standardized way of reporting all the way up to the chain, you're going to have variances then in potential for outcomes, because we want to standardize outcomes. If you've done something heinous, should be a pretty severe outcome. If you've done something that could be considered unintentional but nonetheless was bad behavior, that's met in a different way. It's kind of like in the military with the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We do have that flexibility. But in this case, let's talk about standardization. If we had all the VISN directors here, do you think, based upon now, you're into it, that we would hear a standardized answer from them as to how they're implementing the act as we envisioned it?
No.
Okay. Is there an effort or a hope that we could get it to an 80% commonality?
Yes, sir, and that's why I'm short with that first answer. I mean, this organization has part of its culture a lot of independence from VISN to VISN, medical center to medical center. Those things we've pointed out different times. If you visited one medical center, you've visited one medical center. That's not a great thing to say in all categories, especially not in this. So it's going to require more engagement. It has required at times even working with the senior leadership teams to address that lack of seeing things the same way and kind of getting on the same page.
Do we have enough data now, or are we getting close to having enough data that has come out of the different VISNs to say, wow, here's really they've got their act together here. This is an example that for those other VISNs maybe who are more challenged in this arena to say, okay, if you can't figure it out yourself, try what VISN X is doing?
It has really been a lead by example. We have several VISNs that have, and we see this mostly on the whistleblower protection side, with VISN directors taking the lead with reintegrating their whistleblowers that have been, probably in their words, thorns in their side for a long time for a lot of the right reasons, but they've just kind of held that back. They've opened up and allowed those people to come in and reintegrate into their organization and provide the value that they can. So we've had a few that have shown what can be done. It's getting the word out all to the others and then showing them, or sometimes strongly encouraging them, that this is the same behaviors, the same attitude, the same way that they should be treating those same type of issues.
Do you think that, the three of you are sitting here at the table being held accountable by us. If we had all of the VISN directors sitting at the table instead of you all, do you think they would feel the temperature in the seat like you potentially do?
I know they will this afternoon. I speak to the National Leadership Council of VHA, and I will pass that along.
Well, somehow in several of the oversight hearings that our subcommittee has had, the lack of the sense of urgency that we have sensed, it is, and now it does fall back onto leadership, whether it's ours as a committee here of the whole, communicating that with you, or then you as the leadership communicating it down your chain of command, because unfortunately in the end it all boils down to the same outcome, and that is a veteran or a group of veterans doesn't get the services that they need, they require for a healthy life, for whatever it happens to be to benefit them. And the reason this was put into place was to hold people accountable, but most importantly to protect those who saw bad behavior and felt compelled on behalf of the veterans to raise their hand and say, hey, this is wrong. So I see my time is about to expire here, but we're here with you. We just need to, we'll give you all the hammers you need, but you need to swing them. Yes. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Rice, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Rourke, the committee received many statements for the record from former VA employees about their experience after becoming whistleblowers. These experiences included problems with OAWP not keeping their disclosures confidential, which resulted in severe retaliation. Obviously, this is very concerning since the very purpose of the creation of OAWP was intended to actually centralize the whistleblower protection in one place to prevent such things from happening anymore. I just want to point out two of the statements that happened while you were the head of OAWP. The first was from a physician by the name of Dale Klein, who stated that it was difficult to get the opportunity to talk to his OAWP case manager, and that the case manager had not even planned to interview him in reviewing his case. He said his case manager was not even aware of an OIG finding on his whistleblower case, and that ultimately OAWP did nothing to protect him from being fired. So that's number one. Number two, you had an engineer by the name of Daniel Martin who stated that OAWP notified the senior officials against whom he was doing the whistleblowing about his disclosure. And as a result of that, he experienced retaliation that has essentially stripped him of his job, except in name only. So these seem to me to be two examples of the whistleblower protection actually doing the exact opposite. So what say you about this, since you were in charge of that department?
We'll address Dr. Klein first. That case predated the establishment of OAWP, and his case was much down the road before any of us got involved in that. So his identity of his own accord was already proliferated everywhere. His case in particular has been reviewed by OSC. We didn't have the chance to investigate it because it wasn't even in our hands, but I believe that case resolved with him being removed and the Office of Special Counsel supporting that decision. Now, the people that had initially been found with doing some retaliation to him, initially, there's a lot more details in this case that we need to go into. They were disciplined for retaliation because they did, frankly, screw up. They did not handle that the way they should have.
So disciplined, were they removed?
They got the mandatory OSC retaliation penalty of 14-day suspension.
So that's the problem. The punishment for people who retaliate against whistleblowers isn't strong enough, is basically what you're saying.
That's the mandatory. To be honest, in that case, there was several other mitigating factors. It was almost a technicality to charge them with retaliation.
So why does it seem to me that there's always the benefit of the doubt given to the people who retaliate against whistleblowers than is well, no, but you can shake your head.
I don't agree with that.
Well, okay, but we've seen example after example of it. So I have limited time. I just want to get to the hotline. What is the status of the hotline? There's still no oversight mechanism on the hotline?
OIG hotline or?
The whistleblower hotline?
So it's the toll-free number that we maintain?
The toll-free, yeah.
There is oversight in the sense of OIG looking at the files?
No, oversight to make sure that it is actually being implemented.
It exists today.
People know that, well, I know it exists, but there doesn't seem to be much information out there about how people can access it.
I will take that as a critique. I mean, it has been an effort that we...
It's a fact.
Well, it's communication throughout the organizations. This has been a top-down communication of getting the word out. We've done all employee emails. The word has gone out. It's the consistency of that and having folks realize there is a new outlet for their disclosure. There's already a hotline at OIG. There's already a hotline at OSC. There are multiple ways for disclosures to be made. Ours is the latest one that got created last June. So it's going to take a time before everyone understands exactly and really which one to use, because it is confusing to whistleblowers. We know this. We hear this.
Okay, then how do we make it less confusing? Why don't you tell us how we can make it less confusing?
Create one.
Okay, that's a great idea.
Then you have to take it away from the Office of Inspector General and the Office of Special Counsel, which are governed by other statutes. I don't want to be glib on that.
There are oversight features.
I think whistleblowers should have as many outlets for making disclosure as they need, and we will work out the complexity on the back end of where that disclosure is. That requires more cooperation between the folks that receive them.
The problem is that if you flood people with information, it's how you get information to people,
sure,
and how efficiently you do it and how easy you make it for people to actually dial a number. And I think there needs to be obviously some more oversight in that field. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Welcome. Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. Mr. Mast, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. O'Rourke. You got a great colonel sitting behind you. I've known the man for a number of years, so I'm glad to see him working with you. I'm the end user of the VA to the T. I get every bit of my health care through the VA. I hold weekly office hours in the VA for any veteran that wants to talk about any issue, VA related or otherwise. I'm walking the halls there frequently. I see them. I see my fellow veterans constantly. I see the smiles on them, and I see their truly heartfelt gratitude when they get the care that they were seeking at the VA. And I also see their frustration when their care was lacking in timeliness or appropriateness, and I hear about it both, as we all do. And that's, in summation, what we all want to see. We want to see the care for every end user of the VA just be the best possible care that it can be. It's, it's summed up very simply like that. I think we all agree on that. It's what we want to see. Now, you've said in this hearing several times that you want to see a change in the culture of the VA. So I just want to give you a chance to espouse upon that. What would you change in the culture of the VA if you had a wand, if you could build it up brick by brick from the beginning? What would change in the culture of the VA for you? What would be your tolerance for any negligence whatsoever, big or small? What would you change about that? That's my only question for you. I give you the next 3 minutes and 20 seconds to espouse upon how you would change the culture of the VA and what you want to see out of that, sir.
So in the context of, first starting with the context of the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, I want us to all acknowledge that that's where this starts. It starts with accountability, whether it is a frontline employee making a bed, or whether it's a medical center director that has multiple issues going on during the day but needs to find where he or she should put their priorities. We know that from observation. When you meet veterans that are walking through a hospital that just passed the medical center director and got to speak with them briefly, they know that the leadership there at that local level is engaged. In the medical centers that I visit, you can feel the difference when leadership is engaged in that way. So the first thing would be is medical center directors, leadership, fully engaged with their veterans, fully engaged with their staff, listening to them, raising concerns, raising issues, whether it's funding, whether it's just alignment of resources, bringing those up and down the chain of command and having that be seamless and transparent. One of the things that is frustrating a lot of times is between our administrations, between our staff offices, we have a lot of times where we don't work together on problems. We try to work on them either individually or we just try to not think about them too much. Breaking down those barriers between, whether it's between IT and VHA, whether it's between VHA and VBA, working problems collaboratively with the veteran's outcome in mind. That has been said before. That's not something new from anybody to hear, but it is truly in the execution of that, from the very building the processes to support that. That's what would change. I would change immediately if I could. But that involves personalities. That involves people have been doing things their whole careers. Getting them to move away from those well-established, well-developed opinions and processes is difficult. It takes time. But when you have a law like this that links together and I'll keep saying it, Chairman Aurora and I talked about it over the weekend, why I don't think we give ourselves or the Congress gives themselves enough credit on this is they put together accountability, performance with this whistleblower retaliation, whistleblower protection piece, which, as we even talked about, it's not well defined, and we get stories that come in different ways, and I'm not discrediting any of them, but really getting to the truth and getting the facts of those is difficult, and it requires people to withhold judgment sometimes, but then look at all the facts and then make determinations there, not just go off on a track. So why I think this is so critical is that it gives us the tools as leadership to talk to other leaders and say, here's how you need to hold yourself accountable, hold your people accountable, how you should be performing, and it not just be an empty discussion. and then say, I'm going to come back in 6 months. If you haven't done these things, I'm going to remove you. I'm going to end your federal service, which is a huge thing. That is not anything that any of us in this office ever came to lightly. When we go to a medical center director and say, your service is now over, sometimes when they've had 15, 20 years of service, that is a monumental thing to do, but it's what's going to motivate them to get better, and it's when it's going to motivate them to be more accountable to their employees. So you see it when you see it at a medical center. I'd love to take those folks and make an example of them across the rest of the VA and say this is how everybody should operate, but I've gone over my time.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Field. Mr. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for being here today with us. At the VA, serving veterans should always come first. We have to value whistleblowers who call out bad actors and toxic culture. In fact, that's why a lot of us supported the Accountability Act, which was a big stretch for a lot of us, to give the VA the tools to make sure that everyone, from the secretary all the way down to everyone who's in the cafeteria, is serving the veteran, not the bureaucracy. And I think we were on board with that. Former Secretary Sulkin said he didn't think that this would be a tool that was going to lead to mass firings. Dan Caldwell of Concerned Veterans of America wrote an article entitled, "One Accountable Government Board Stands in the Way of VA Accountability," because before this bill, senior officials could appeal decisions to the Merit Protection Systems Board. Now they can't. In that article, he writes that that board had a history of blocking demotions or firings of negligent and bad senior VA employees. And the current SVAC chairman, Senate Chairman Isaacson, said he thought the bill would create a culture of accountability at the VA. So at its passage, a lot of Democrats signaled concern that this would be taken advantage of. Ultimately, supported the bill. I supported the bill because we thought it was the best compromise to hold the VA accountable to fix its own culture. And I just want to explore the possibility that, and you've addressed some of the numbers, that we not create a culture of fear as opposed to accountability. A culture of fear that makes the VA's employees feel like any small mistake could mean losing their job, or prevents whistleblowers from stepping up and having faith in the accountability system. My colleague, Ms. Custer, rightly observed last year that senior executives are the level at which decisions end up being made, not the lower level folks. So I wonder, also just refer to one more thing. VA put a press release out on April 25th, 2018. It's very short. It says, under VA's new leadership, which is now firmly aligned with President Trump and his priorities, the department's operations have improved in many ways. In a number of cases, employees who are wedded to the status quo and not on board with this administration's policies or pace of change have now departed VA. I wonder under what circumstances you think that disagreeing with the administration is a fireable offense.
I think that's ever factored in any of the processed actions that we've taken at VA.
Well, I guess let me explore. Obviously, if someone at the senior, I don't know who these individuals are. I appreciate some, maybe without identifying who they were, kind of what does that mean? People who weren't on board. Why have they left? Were they asked to leave, or what's the context for that?
Anytime you start shifting the operation of an organization to start focusing on things like veterans, whether it's electronic health record, Mission Act, those kind of things, folks realize maybe on their own that they don't want to be there. I think there's a few cases that we could look at of folks in senior positions where they advocated for a different approach, and then the organization went in a different direction, and they just felt like that wasn't a place they wanted to be anymore. That's a personal decision people get.
And so that in these cases, really, it just dawned on them that I don't match this organization anymore. It's time for me to leave. Is that what you're saying? No one was asked to leave?
No, not in the cases I think you're probably referring to, because those really ended up being, in fact, some cases we found that there really wasn't an alignment at all with where the VA was going. So I'm actually surprised they stayed as long as they did.
And I understand, too, that if someone's not on board with the policies at the high senior level, that they might be asked to leave.
Well, I would even go even further than that. I mean, we're not talking about policies. We were talking about things like the electronic health record, the decisions that were made there, both by Dr. Shulkin, by this committee, or by the Congress, and also the Mission Act. I mean, we have some very historic and transformative changes happening at VA that are going to change the status quo. And I think you know, when that really became the reality for the organization, folks had to sit back and take stock of that and see what they wanted to do.
How are you assuring that people aren't disciplined or fired for their own personal political beliefs? And we just had an example of this in the FBI, where a gentleman was, by all evidence, was doing his job, actually was removed from the case because there was a perception he was biased. How do you parse out when people's personal feelings about the administration might be out of line, but they're doing their job okay? Are you trying to protect those people?
When those people, in that case, make a whistleblower disclosure on something unrelated to politics, absolutely. They get the same protections as whistleblowers across the board. In misconduct cases, misconduct is not, it has a very specific definition. It's not political. It
has nothing to do with a person's political beliefs, individual political beliefs. No. Okay. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Rourke, let me just dive right in here. How many employees do you have who were hired for a specific job, duties probably outlined in the posting, who are now spending 100% of their time on union activity or official time? So almost 500 employees who spend 100% of their time on something other than the job they were hired to do. How do you hold those people accountable?
I believe the recent executive orders will require all employees to go back on time. I think it's 25% is the only required or the only allowable union time.
Can you hold those employees accountable for doing a job they were hired to do if they're spending 100% of their time on union activity and not the taxpayer-funded, needed for serving our veterans job that they were hired to do? Can you hold them accountable?
With the implementation of the VATAS
currently, can you hold them accountable under the current construct?
We weren't.
I mean, the answer is no. I mean, it's no. Let's get to it. It's no. And I hope you change it. I had a law that we passed out of the committee, one of the most disappointing experiences on the committee because it was a partisan vote. Didn't get one of my colleagues to vote to reduce that to 25%. I think that's reasonable. Do you know what the legal standard is for administering official time? I'm not going to try to stump you. Let me just read it.
Sure.
You can have official time, but it has to be administered in a way that's reasonable, necessary, and in the best interest of the public. Do you believe somebody spending 100% of their time on union activity or official time is reasonable, necessary, or in the best interest of the public?
I think I'd like to answer that question by saying I'm looking forward to getting, especially the 11 psychologists that are on 100% union time, back to serving veterans in an area from mental health that is very critical for the VA.
Well, let me ask your colleagues, do you think 100% of time spent outside of the job they were hired to do is reasonable, necessary, and in the best interest of the public? This is the law of the land. This is what we're supposed to do as a committee, is to hold people accountable to the laws of the land. Is it reasonable?
And I can tell you I was hired to serve veterans, and when you're not serving veterans, I think we need to take a hard look at what we're doing to get you back to serving veterans.
It's hard to serve a veteran when you were hired to do a job and then you end up spending 100% of your time on a job. I'm telling you, anybody listening to this across this great country is scratching their head about how in the world we can create a culture of accountability when you have policies in place where somebody can spend 100% of their time on something other than what they're hired to do, and that's acceptable. How can that be acceptable? What about you, Mr. Nicholas? Do you think it's reasonable?
No.
Okay, thank you. It's great to get a direct answer. I hope there's no retribution. Maybe you need to file a whistleblower complaint when you get back so you're protected, but because I worry for you now, but I appreciate the honesty, and the American people appreciate it. Do people have a constitutional right to a job at the VA?
No, sir, not that I'm aware of.
Should the public sector employees be held to a different standard of accountability than those 130 million hardworking, God-fearing, tax-paying Americans who work outside of the federal government? Should there be two different standards?
No, sir.
Do VA employees retain their right to sue if they're wrongfully terminated? Do they have that right?
Yes, sir.
So they retain that right. Do they have the right to go choose to leave the VA and work somewhere else if they don't like the way they're treated and they feel like they were performing, and et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, sir.
Do the 130 million people who are not part of the federal government system in the VA, do they have a Merit System Protection Board? And what's their standard of evidence when they're fired? Is it substantial evidence or is it preponderance of evidence? Which one? When a private sector employee, someone outside the federal government, is fired, what's the standard by which the employee has to present their case in order to fire that employee? Is it substantial evidence or preponderance of evidence?
They don't have MSP.
They don't have an evidence. So, okay. But they, okay. Let me go back to the line of questioning of my colleague, Mr. Takano. You said in 2014, were there about the same proportionately low wage and veteran employees that were moved then as there are now proportionately? Yes, so there's no difference, it just percentage-wise. There may be more numbers, but as a percentage, the same percentage or trend then exists today.
Yes, sir.
Is there a carve-out for veterans who don't perform well consistently to not be fired?
No, sir.
Is there a carve-out for disabled veterans if they're not performing consistently well not to be fired?
No, sir.
Is there a carve-out for low-wage people or high-wage people or blonde-haired people or blue-eyed people that aren't performing well? Is there a carve-out for those guys? Because I'd like to know it. That's a loophole. We need to fix it.
No, sir.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Mr. Correa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, the VA has a very important mission to take care of our veterans who served our country honorably. The job is really one of function of personnel. 99% of the services are personnel related. Personnel management, an important issue. GAO, the Disabled American Veterans, have said there's issues of personnel management. Morale, retention. We've talked about removing employees. My question to you is, what have we done to retain employees? In this committee, we've talked about the fact that salaries aren't competitive in many places. So what are we doing? What do we need to do to make sure that we hold on to those valued employees at the VA?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the context of the accountability and whistleblower protection law, it is that accountability piece. When employees don't feel safe, when they want to blow the whistle and can't or don't feel like they can, if they blow the whistle and don't see anything happen, maybe they just talk to their supervisor and say, there's a problem here, and they don't see a response, that's an accountability issue. And before, when we could have a culture of well, if I don't do something this time, it's not going to make any difference, and an inconsistency of an application of standards, you develop those problems over time. This law at least provided some tools, some more tools, for us to be able to address that. But it is going to be the intent. You're exactly right. It has to be our intent as leadership, and then to make sure that we hold each level of management accountable to then provide those employees at every level.
Let me ask the question in a different context. We've been talking about removing employees. Flip it around. Retaining employees. What are we doing to make their life at the VA something that people wake up and say, you know what, I'm going to have a great day, I'm going to go help veterans?
Well, sir, I think that's where the job I have is actually fairly easy. Serving veterans is the best job you can have. I'm sorry, I even told the group of political appointees when we first got here, you will not have a more righteous job than working at the VA because you get to serve veterans.
But yet we have an issue with turnover.
I say we've got a complex HR system and a complex system in general, and it's going to require very intentional work on our part, on your part.
And this is not an issue of gotcha. And Mr. Arcton, before you, Jody, before you leave, I'm going to follow up on some of your comments. But again, just, want to work with you, try to figure out how do we make it a better place for employees to work. And I wanted to make sure you stayed here, Jody, because I wanted to follow up with some of your lines of questionings in the 2 minutes I've got. Are there any other employees that should be at the VA that you've lent to other agencies or other organizations that should really be at the VA as opposed to be working somewhere else?
Not that I'm aware of, but let me check back to be completely accurate with that question, but I don't believe we make a habit. I know I've detailed lots of people to
Mr. Arrington is, he's got a good point, which is you're supposed to be dedicating 100% of your time working, taking care of our vets. I just want to make sure, are there any other employees at the VA that are not actually working at the VA, but maybe other departments that you've lent out to or have assigned to?
Like I said, sir, I'm not aware of any. And like I said, we've actually detailed or brought employees from DOD, HHS, other places to VA to help us. A great example is the lady running our EHRM program is from HHS. Highly qualified, highly skilled in this area. We brought the best we could find to lead that project here at VA.
I'd like to, if you could go back and look at your notes and see if there's other folks out there that are actually not working in the VA that should be working in the VA.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't, sir, I'm not aware of any.
Thank you very much.
Yield.
Yeah, I'm going to yield the rest of mine. Go ahead.
You went along with the characterization that official time is union time. You actually used the term yourself. Is it true that official time can be used to conduct union business? Does not the law prohibit that from happening?
I believe the law does prohibit that.
And why did you refer, the law does prohibit it, right, currently?
I believe that's what you...
So why did you respond to Mr. Arrington's question as going along with the conflation of using union time and official time, saying that they're the same thing? Are they the same thing?
They're commonly referred to as the same thing.
So, but are they the same thing?
Well, I'm sure there's different legal definitions that we've...
Are they the same thing? They're not the same thing. We've gotten lazy in our language. They are not the same thing, and that's the opportunism that's being exploited by Mr. Arrington by going after union time after official time. Official time is not union time. It's not time to conduct union business. Is that correct?
Sir, I want to get
Is that
11
correct?
psychologists back to work.
Is that correct? It's a simple answer.
That they're same.
They're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing, but at the end of the day, they are the same thing.
That's fine. Thank you. I accept
there
your
are
answer,
people
sir.
not
Thank
working.
you. It's not the same thing.
Gentleman's time's expired. Ms. Higgins, you recognize 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield a minute of my time to my colleague, Mr. Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. I think it is the same thing. I think we're trying to parse words up here. I think if you laid it out, and I wish I had it in front of me, I hope somebody can get it and just read through it. You can have somebody on, quote, official time, which is, I believe, time spent on union activity, actually lobby Congress. That's one of the issues or activities that have been applied and determined acceptable. They go to union conferences. There are all sorts of things that I would say it's union activity. I'm not saying there shouldn't be unions. I'm saying you can't spend 100% of your time if you're hired to be a physician to take care and provide health services to a veteran and then end up spending 100% of your time lobbying Congress for your union, being at conferences for your union. I just don't think that's acceptable. I don't think it's reasonable, necessary, or in the best interest of the public. I'm just trying to follow the law. So I yield back to my colleague, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Jody. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of bipartisanship, perhaps we could consider as a committee a round table to discuss this issue. It's passionate. We all care about the same thing. Mr. O'Rourke, thank you for being here. Do you generally recognize, sir, that this is an era of reform in the VA, that the VA has been a mess, man, for decades? It didn't get that way under one administration or one executive or one VA committee. And this committee, in a very bipartisan manner, has touched my spirit, has embraced the challenge to reform the VA. But does the VA get it, that this is an era of reform?
I don't think any organization self-reforms. It's going to be what the leadership of this Congress.
Is there a clear understanding within the culture that you described? If you could change one thing, or if you could identify one thing that reflects this era of the VA, is that it's an era of accountability. But I'm going to talk about, is there consequence to accountability? So I'm just asking you, sir, generally speaking, as a man, as an American, is it recognized within the VA that we have to reform this thing?
I think there's a growing number of people in the VA that recognize that.
Okay, for the record, I'd like you to answer, are MSPB judges providing deference to VA's decisions and not mitigating penalties?
Yes.
Are arbitrators following the Act's timelines, and are they giving deference to the penalty decision?
Not consistently.
And what could be done, or perhaps you could provide in writing for the committee, what could be done, what could we do as a body to help you enforce within the executive the arbitrators following the Act's timeline? Let me ask you, sir, are you familiar with confidential informants that are used across the country in law enforcement?
Yes, sir.
And the key word there is confidential. You know what happens to a confidential informant if the detectives or the department reveals their identity?
Yes.
Yeah, we pretty much find them in a ditch somewhere. So the whistleblowers, to me, are the equivalent of confidential informants. And I reflect a concern of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle regarding the protection of whistleblowers' identities. How can there be any complaints of retaliation if we're effectively protecting the identity of whistleblowers?
And that's what you bring up is a great point, because with retaliatory or retaliation cases, the identity of the whistleblower is no longer protected.
Exactly.
But you get to the earlier point of how do we protect
there can be no retaliation if
yes.
there's no identity exposed. So I think we should have great concern amongst the executive and amongst this body regarding the crucial import of the protection of whistleblowers' identities, because they are, in effect, confidential informants, and no more will come forward. We will dampen this reform effort if we don't place a great deal of emphasis on the protection of these identities. I'd just like to say that in cases that have been brought up by my colleagues regarding someone that's been accused of egregious behavior, are they allowed to continue on a job, or are they placed on unpaid administrative leave?
Depending on their functional area, local decisions made on whether to remove them from that.
You have the power to place them on unpaid administrative leave?
I believe that's been severely restricted, and it was abused in the past, so we've had new rules around that.
And perhaps you need that power. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
I thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Lamb, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Rourke, just a couple of questions about the union time, official time line of discussion. That time, whatever you want to call it, that is governed by the collective bargaining agreement between AFG and the VA, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that collective bargaining agreement is struck between the members of AFG and the VA, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that's something that those members were free to contract on their own with the VA, correct?
Yes.
And decide how they want that time to be used as part of the contract.
Yes, one fact in that is that this is a contract we've had rolled over for how many years now? 7?
7 years.
But it's
yes, just
no one held a gun to your head, right? It's a freely bargained contract between the VA
no.
and the members.
No.
Okay.
Although, to be very clear, we did negotiate away management rights that we were not supposed to do.
Sure, but the contract stands, and it's transparent and open to the public.
It is, yes.
Okay. Now, you were in the military as well, right, Mr. O'Rourke?
Yes.
Okay. And in the military, officers are frequently held accountable for the actions of their subordinates, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you're familiar with the phrase, officers eat last?
Yes.
Part of the military culture is that people at the top are supposed to look out for the people below them and take accountability for their actions, even if it's not the officer's direct fault. They have responsibility for the people underneath them.
Yes.
And that promotes a pretty good culture in the military, right?
For the most part, yes.
Do you draw on your experiences in the military in leading the VA?
I try to be cognizant that I'm in a civilian agency, but yes.
Is there overlap between the kind of culture you'd like to promote in the VA and what you experienced in the military? As it relates to leadership?
Given our customer base being veterans, yes, because that's their expectations from what their shared experiences are.
I mean, one thing I saw in the Marine Corps was that when you create that kind of culture, you have leaders affirmatively go out and take responsibility for the people below them, even when no one tells them to. And the people below them see that, and they want to succeed for the person who's leading them, because they don't want the person who's leading them to get fired if they like them, if they think they're doing a good job. I mean, that's like when you talk about creation of a culture, that's what ends up happening day to day. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. So if we just look at 2018 under the operation of this law, there have been about 15 managers fired overall.
I think that's
an
about
accurate
right.
number. And it's fair to say, whatever the number is, there have been hundreds of housekeepers, food service workers, and nursing assistants fired in that same time.
think that's where our military analogy starts to break down a little bit, because we're talking about high turnover, hourly waged.
Right, I'm just talking, though, about people who've been fired. There have been hundreds of people in those three categories.
Also, we need to understand that we're talking about highly desperate numbers of employees. I mean, we have 400 SESs. We have
but
tens of
that
thousands.
comparison of absolute numbers is accurate, that there have been 15.
I think we need to look at the percentages.
Yeah.
So if you look at senior leader removals as a percentage and the change,
you're saying they're
starts to
consistent
normalize
across
a little
time. Exactly. At the same time, we have a lot of vacancies in those lower level positions, right? And in Pittsburgh, for example, near where my district is, we've seen 46 adverse action against low level employees since the law was implemented. And there are 300 vacancies among similar positions. So I want to ask you, if you are one of the people who are left who has not been fired, let's say you're a food service worker or a housekeeper, you've seen 46 of your colleagues receive adverse actions in the past year. There are 300 of your potential colleagues who are missing because there are vacancies. You'd agree that increases the workload for you, right? You probably have more of a workload than you would have.
I think we need to put this in context, because I believe there's probably the same number fired the year before and the year before that. So it's
right,
not
but as the state of affairs today, there are people missing at the lower levels from the VA in places like Pittsburgh.
These are not easy places to hire into, and with the veterans preference, which we hold to, it makes it even more difficult to fill those positions sometimes.
So from
level.
from a housekeeper's vantage point, they've seen 46 of their colleagues punished in the last year. They see 300 of them missing. Their work is additional every single day, and very few, if any, managers have been dismissed in that time. Do you think that they feel like they're part of a culture where officers eat last today?
I don't believe that's going to be the best way to describe that, since we're talking about folks.
I don't think so either. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Secretary, and thank you all for being here today. I appreciate that. And being no further questions, the first panel is dismissed. I'd like to invite our second panel to the witness table. And thank you for your service. Joining us on our second panel this morning is Mr. J. David Cox. Mr. Cox, welcome. The National President of the American Federation of Government Employees. Mr. Cox, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Accountability Act has turned out to be the most counterproductive VA law ever enacted. It has demoralized and harmed its dedicated workforce, a third of whom are veterans themselves. Here's what so-called accountability looks like under the new law. Although the VA has tried to hide the facts by denying information requests from Congress and AFGE, its own published data tell a terrible story. Of the 1,096 VA employees fired in the first 5 months of 2018, only 15 were supervisors, and that doesn't mean they're just SESers. Housekeeping aides, virtually all of whom are disabled vets, were the largest number fired, followed by nursing assistants, registered nurses, food service workers, and medical support assistants. These 5 groups make up 51% of all removals. The VA has refused to provide information on veteran status, gender, or race of those fired, probably to hide the disproportionate effect of this harsh law on the most vulnerable individuals. Even though we don't have complete data, the disproportionate impact on VA's lowest paid and veteran workforce is undeniable. All of our current openings for housekeeping aides are for preference-eligible veterans, and virtually all pay less than $35,000 annually. Nursing assistant positions start at around $30,000, and food service national postings list hourly wages as low as $11 an hour. These are the jobs of the people being fired under the new accountability law. This destructive law was enacted despite warnings from experts that mismanagement, not the union, and not job protections for frontline employees was undermining the VA's capability to deliver services to veterans. Healthcare experts repeatedly presented evidence that the VA healthcare system outperforms the private sector. Before anyone points to the Phoenix scandal as justification for this law, please recall that statements by Phoenix VA patient schedulers confirm that the waitlist gaming was caused by severe shortages of providers and distorted management incentive systems, not the union, contract, and not incompetent or heartless workers who couldn't be fired. Gaming the scheduling system has been a product ever since post-9/11 veterans started returning home with complex medical needs over 15 years ago. We've been telling Congress that chronic short staffing was causing waitlist manipulation and severe access problems at VA medical centers. We had also been asking for additional staff to reduce the claims backlog at VBA. Yet, thanks to the accountability law, 4 essential claims processing positions, veteran service representative, rating specialist, claims examiner, and claims assistants, were among the largest groups of fired employees in 2018. Destroying federal employee due process and union rights continue to be the vehicles of choice for those intent on destroying the civil service and starving the VA into further privatization. In the accountability law, the lower standard of evidence in particular has lent fuel to the firing of employees, along with preventing MSPB administrative judges from imposing a lesser penalty when the evidence doesn't support removal. Before the accountability law, VA routinely offered employees a chance to improve their performance before firing them. Now the agency is using its new authority not to shorten PIPs, but to go straight to firing. Finally, the act was supposed to improve protections for whistleblowers, but as we warned, it has had the opposite effect. It's easier than ever to fire a whistleblower, and you can see examples of how this has occurred in my written statement. I want to conclude by pointing out that while the VA has not yet moved to evict all union representatives from their offices, as the Social Security Administration did last week, no conversation about federal labor management relations should occur without addressing this. President Trump is attempting to ruthlessly bust our union and with his executive orders. While many members of Congress have spoken out against these lawless and severe decrees, I ask that this committee act to stop the VA from behaving in the same horrendous manner as SSA. This committee has an obligation to the democracy for which veterans risk their lives to prevent the executive branch from breaking the law and destroying federal unions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be glad to take any questions from anyone.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. And just for the record, when I came to the Congress in 2009, the VA had about 250,000 employees, and we were spending about $97.5 billion on benefits, cemeteries, and health care. The President's ask in this budget's $192.5 billion. And there are now, I'm not sure what the number is, but 360 or 370,000 members at the VA. It's larger than the United States Navy. So we've added 100 and something thousand employees in the last 9 years and doubled the budget. And that looks to me like if the VA is managing its assets, and I don't disagree with you, I think management is a huge part of this equation. We're not doing something right. We're not getting a bang for our buck if we're doing that. How do you, and basically what evidence do you have that the accountability law is being used improperly when I'm looking at GS 0, 1 through 6, where pre-OAWP, 61.2% of the dismissals were there, and now it's 58.6. So it's the percentage actually in the 1 to 6 have gone down, not up.
Mr. Chairman, I think if you would look at the fact that 15 management employees, and I heard the acting secretary refer, there's only 400 and some SESers. There are tens of thousands of managers throughout the rank and file of the VA, from housekeeping aides, supervisors, food service supervisors, and many of those, and 15 is a grossly disproportionate. The Phoenix scandal was all caused by top management in that VA, by management incentives, and which we all know it was not from the frontline employees who were blowing the whistle, who our union had to represent, because that management was trying to fire them, sir. And also, I'd like to add, many of these veterans are returning and continue to return, and we are not making just a 50-year commitment. We're making a 60, possibly 70-year commitment to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of veterans. And yeah, the number of staff is going up, but there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of veterans whose lives have changed. I've suffered with a broke leg for a little while, and I have learned what veterans are suffering every day of their life.
My question
and they
is
gave
not
their
to,
blood
not
for
to
their
filibuster
country.
my time, but basically, this Congress, this bipartisan committee, have provided resources to the VA. There's no question
we're
about
thankful
that.
for what you've done.
And we've, as I said, we've over doubled the amount of money in the where the remainder, the other part of the discretionary part of our budget here, until we voted for the omnibus budget in March of this year, had remained flat. So we took money from other agencies and funded the VA, and I think it's disingenuous to say that we're not providing, or imply that this committee and this Congress is not providing resources for the VA. And I don't disagree with you, Mr. Cox, on management. I think that's part of our problem. Let me ask you a second question. Do you think there are fireable offenses at the VA? Do you think there are reasons you should be terminated?
Yes, sir, and I've said that every time I've come before your committee or any other committee in any government agency, there's wrongdoings that should be fired.
Thank you. And if the law is being done properly, what would you do to change this law if it's not being done as it was written and it's intended, as I said, on a voice vote from the United States Senate?
I would change the law to go back for the proper penalties, the ability of MSPB judges to mitigate penalties, because due process and having those checks and balances is the way we avoid having a politicized federal workforce. And now, when we basically have employees who can be fired at will, we have somewhat of a politicized federal workforce, and there was a reason why we have MSPB and other entities for the federal employees.
So you would recommend going back to what we had, which clearly wasn't working. I'm not saying this is working perfectly yet, but what we had was not working either. In your written statement, you said that the law has, quotes, deprived veterans who depend on the VA for health care and benefits of the services of employees with extensive training and experience who've been fired under the Act's new authorities without a fair chance to improve their performance. Even if I accept this premise, why is it such great employees with extensive training and experience need time to improve their performance?
Number one, many of our veteran preference veterans that are hired, they are hired with service-connected disabilities, one of them PTSD, and many of us know that have a background, as I'm a nurse and you're a doctor, we understand the illness of PTSD, and working with those employees, and also that their behavior sometimes we have to de-escalate, and I will commend some other government agencies that has realized that and has tried to put in accommodating situations for people with PTSD, and we understand sometimes if you're in a wheelchair or have a visible disability, but there are many disabilities veterans have that we need to certainly try to work with.
My time's expired. Mr. Takano?
Thank you. Mr. Cox, Mr. O'Rourke said that one of the things that they've been doing to ensure smooth implementation and protection of whistleblowers is listening, including listening to employee unions. Do you feel that you have been included, or your members have been included in productive conversations with VA about the implementation of this law?
No, sir, we haven't, and I would point out that with this Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, we are not aware of any training or any mechanism that the VA has done to try to train rank and file employees. I believe I heard Mr. O'Rourke say that they had trained managers. We are not aware of any training. We at one time had requested the telephone number we publicized for our membership to allow them to at least have it, and after that I think the VA put out the number.
How much time does a housekeeping aide, typically the employees for which the veterans' preference and non-competitive set-aside was meant to benefit, how much time does a housekeeping aide get to improve their performance as compared to, say, a VISN director who is not implementing the law properly?
Currently, the VA is saying it would only give maybe 30 days, and many times they're not even giving 30 days for a housekeeping aide to improve their performance. And historically, and I worked in the VA many, many years, I saw bad managers be transferred from one VA to another VA with gigantic relocations, bonuses, and various things. And I know this committee has certainly investigated that, and you couldn't deny those facts. They stand for themselves, sir.
The picture that my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Lamb, presents about these huge number of vacancies, these low-level jobs, these entry-level areas in housekeeping, that's, I mean, the vacancies. But then the idea that 40, 50 people are dismissed in 1 year has got to have an impact on morale. Go ahead, sir.
It does have an impact on morale, and particularly when people believe that folks are fired without a due process. When people have their due process rights, they are offered opportunities to improve. They don't improve, and I'll agree with what the chairman said. I mean, some people, I believe, fire themselves. The VA or no other entity fires them, but that burden shifts on them. But people need to be given an opportunity, and they need to be properly instructed. Many times there's training issues and all.
Mr. Cox, Mr. O'Rourke also talked about training in whistleblower rights. Has AFG heard of any non-management employees receiving training on their whistleblower rights?
No, sir, we haven't.
I heard Mr. O'Rourke sort of say quietly, as he was concluding his testimony, he was kind of complaining about the veterans' preference, that that's the reason why that there are these vacancies at places like Mr. Lamb's facility. And I've heard similar complaints made about Loma Linda's inability to hire sufficient housekeeping staff. And let's be clear, housekeeping staff is not an unskilled position. They need to be trained in biohazards. It's a very important role in keeping the facilities clean and keeping the everything moving. Is that a fair defense that the veterans' preference is getting in the way of hiring sufficient staff?
Sir, I believe that veterans who have served this country loyally and put it all on the line so that I have the freedom of speech and all the rights that everyone in this room has, and that we have the greatest checks and balances in our government, they deserve those jobs, and I will always say veterans' preference ought to prevail.
In this executive order, really restricting the use of official time, is official time and being able to, could it be used to help some of these veterans who are employed in these positions, especially the ones with PTS and in the housekeeping roles? Is that an appropriate use of official time?
Yes, sir, it is.
And is that often what official time is used for?
Yes, sir, it is.
So, I think, and I didn't get time to get into the negotiated collective bargaining agreement, which provided for official time, but I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Dr. Dunn, you recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cox, for joining us here today on this panel. I want to check a few numbers with you. The number of members you have in the VA, I have a number 242,450. Is that roughly correct?
We represent right at 250,000. I can't give you the exact numbers.
Pretty close.
Say in that neighborhood.
So if we take the union dues, the lowest level of union dues per month, $18, and multiply that out, that's $4,356,000 per month that the AFGE makes, that's $52,272,000 per year. My question to you is, why should the taxpayers be footing the bill for office space, for equipment, supplies, or employees for a union that very clearly has the means to support all of those things on its own?
Well, sir, I'm not sure. You're computing those numbers just out of the VA, and I believe if you check AFGE's national budget, it's about $80 million, and that's coming from all of our government agencies, and you could check our LM that's online. But I would also say, sir, I believe in 1970—
Do I have the number wrong? It's not $18 a month? Is not that not what
our dues would vary all over the country.
That's the lowest number I could find.
No, sir. We have over 1,000 locals. Some of them may be less than $10 a pay period. But to answer your question, in 1978, the Congress of the United States passed the Civil Service Reform Act.
We're not going to, again, I don't want to filibuster our time here. So there are 500, almost 500 employees at the VA who are 100% of the time not doing the job that they were hired to do. These are often highly skilled positions, psychologists and physicians, who are literally hired to be psychologists and physicians and are never seeing patients. Does that make sense to you?
Sir, the law says that we can't discriminate against anyone who chooses to run and want to act as a union official or be elected or to be a union representative, regardless of
talking
profession,
about union
race,
being a
creed,
union
color.
official. Let's talk about using their official time. What the taxpayers are paying their salary, we call this, right? And they're not working for the taxpayers, they're working for the union.
That's where we will disagree. They are working for the taxpayers because the wisdom of Congress in 1978 gave that right of official time, and it would be up to Congress to pass a different law.
Let's talk about the official time for a minute. The legal standard for what constitutes official time is, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, reasonable, necessary, and in the best interest of the public. Is that the best interest of the public, to take a psychologist or a physician and put them, difficult to recruit to the VA, and put them, we have shortages in these positions, and put them to work doing union duties?
Sir, I yield to the wisdom of Congress in 1978 when they passed the law, and we can't discriminate
against anyone. You're taking a risk with yielding to the wisdom of Congress, I'll tell you what. Do you think the Americans at home watching this hearing, how do you think they react to learning that we have literally hundreds of highly paid specialists in the VA who aren't doing a lick of work that they were hired to do?
And, sir, they are doing work they were hired to do because Congress, in its wisdom, passed a law that said official time was reasonable and necessary.
Let me tell you how I think the people back in the 2nd Congressional District of Florida are responding. I think they're shocked. I think they're dismayed. I think they're angry. That's what I think. And I think they demand that we actually fix a problem like this. I don't think I can go home and walk the streets and say, oh, this is okay. Don't worry about it. These hundreds of people, you know, we're paying them much more than you'll ever make to do something that isn't even serving the VA or the veterans. Chairman Rowe offered some statistics concerning the ballooning VA budget and the size of its workforce. I think that those speak for themselves. They're shocking numbers. In 9 years, we've doubled the budget, and we've added 100,000 employees to the rolls. And in the same 9 years, I promise you, I don't think that the VA care has improved by any significant amount, probably just the opposite. So I'm disappointed. I would echo the comments of my, my colleague about reform. I think the VA is in need of reform, and I think we are here to do that, and I'm committed to do that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yielding, Ms. Brownlee, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Cox, for being here today. Certainly your voice is important to this discussion, obviously, but to many discussions we have here in the committee. I wanted to ask you, you know, in your testimony, you also talked about the disproportionate impact on lower-level employees and the percentage of adverse actions impacting general-level employees versus supervisors has remained, the VA's testimony saying that, that those two have remained roughly constant before and after the Accountability Act. Can you Do you agree with that data? Do you agree with that discrepancy?
I disagree in the fact that 15 supervisors, when there are tens of thousands of management officials throughout the VA, and you're telling me only 15 out of 1,096 were managers that had discipline problems or performance problems, but yet 1,085 or 80-some rank and file people were the problems. That seems very disproportionate, because I'd go back to Phoenix. I mean, let's talk about that. It was the SESers, it was those horrible incentives that's in there, and we could talk about VBA, but I think you've all been there many times.
Do you, as an organization, collect any data on employee morale? Doing a survey of such?
We more of it is anecdotal from our locals, but we believe morale is very, very low because there is a real fear of people losing their union rights, losing their rights to representation. There is a great fear in all federal agencies of a politicized civil service workforce, and I think that should scare every one of us to death.
Does the VA reach out to you? They testified this morning that they've got a survey out now and expect the results 45 days from now in terms of trying to measure morale within the VA. Does the VA reach out to you and say, can you help us to make sure that the employees are filling this out? This data is important. Do they reach out to you and ask for your assistance to try, in essence, to get really accurate data?
Since Secretary McDonald and Secretary Shulkin have left, I have not heard a word from the VA.
Thank you. So it's fair to say that in this survey, they talked about the results of the previous survey that's public information not being very good. In this particular survey, they're not reaching out to you in any way for your assistance.
Haven't heard anything from them, ma'am.
You also, in your testimony, you talk about the whistleblower hotline, that it's not being made public. Have you heard reports from employees that it's difficult for them to find the hotline information?
Yes, ma'am, we have. Again, we requested that information, shared it with our membership, and that's how they became aware. And after we did that, the VA came out. And I would say that the union contract is the best thing in the world to protect whistleblowers. And then we've got Office of Special Counsel and the IG. Those have done a very good job. This creating a separate entity becomes somewhat of the fox guarding the hen house. And I think on both sides of this room that there's not a soul that wants more bureaucracy, and AFGE doesn't want more bureaucracy in the protection or the standing in the way of whistleblowers coming forward.
Have you requested that the VA make this whistleblower number public information?
Yes, we have.
And the VA's response was?
I haven't heard a response from them.
You also testified that the VA has essentially stopped using performance improvement plans. Have you seen this across the VA?
Yes, ma'am, I have.
At every level?
At every facility, yes.
Every facility and then sort of at every level, whether it's mid-level, lower level?
I am aware of the rank and file employees. I am not aware of what they do with management employees.
Thanks. I only have a few seconds left, but I know that one of the issues that AFG has struggled with is getting data from the VA as to how the Accountability Act is being implemented. What additional data has AFG requested from VA that's still not available?
I would have to look to some of my folks because we have requested many things and have gotten very little, almost no data. We want to know veterans' preference. We obviously want to know gender. We want to know grievances that revealed fraud, waste, and abuse, the veterans' preference, gender, ethnicity, if they have it, age, all of those type things that would show patterns of treating one person different than others.
But you're not even sure that that data is being collected?
No, we know it's being collected.
You do? Okay.
I am sure it's being collected. The VA collects lots of data.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cox, thank you for appearing before this committee today. I don't know if I've ever witnessed a more passionate union employee.
I'm a passionate registered nurse that cared for veterans for 23 years and loved every second of it also, sir.
And a dedicated union spokesman. There's nothing wrong with that. You see, we should all recognize that we're here to service veterans and Americans. We shouldn't be pro-union or anti-union. We should be pro-American and pro-veteran on both sides of the aisle and on that side of your table. You've made repeated testimony regarding the numbers of VA employees that have been let go. Obviously, there's a process by which a VA employee is fired, like anywhere else. But supervisors, according to your testimony, sir, and I ask you respectfully, that number reflects a disparity, in your opinion, as compared to housekeeping aides, nursing assistants, registered nurses, food service workers, and medical support assistants, which are the largest numbers that have been let go. Would you agree that that's been your testimony, that supervisors being let go, that's a disparate number?
It seems like a very small number in proportion to the fact that there are thousands, tens of thousands
Okay,
of
is it your testimony that it just seems like it or that it is?
Sir, because I don't have all the VA's information and all the things, I have to rely upon the data.
But you're certainly
an
an intelligent gentleman, sir. We're making clear and courageous statements here today. Do you think that not enough supervisors have been fired?
I would say that that would be up to the wisdom of this committee to request that data, and I've heard
I'm
some of
asking
y'all.
your opinion.
In my opinion, I think that the VA needs to make that data available, and maybe they would dispel my my personal feelings or what I would view as
supervisors
information.
members of your union?
No, sir. They are not represented by our union. No, sir.
Okay, and it seems to me that your general consensus is that the existing law that was enacted, the goal of the accountability law was to bring swifter action to VA employees regardless of seniority or lack of seniority or position, and to make sure that the judges didn't circumvent the manager's decisions. So it seems to me that you're stating that the managers that are in place are abusing the existing law and making it non-functional, and that more managers should be fired, more supervisors should be fired. Is that not your statement? Is that not your opinion?
I think that's how you are trying to interpret it, sir, but I'm saying that...
Reinterpret it then, please.
Well,
you believe more supervisors should get fired or not?
I think that any employee who is not doing their due diligence should be held accountable, and it's an accountability law, sir.
And if they're held accountable, should there be a consequence to that accountability?
Yes, sir, there should, with a due process.
And should that sometimes include being fired?
Yes, sir, with a due process, so we avoid an apolitical workforce.
Those VA employees that have been fired, have they all not, in their hiring process, their training, their certifications been clarified and documented in the hiring process? Whatever their position is within the VA, have they not received extensive training and certification for their particular job?
We would certainly hope so, but I'd go back and look at the director at Phoenix, sir. I would go back and look at the director at Phoenix.
It's a matter of law that that qualified individuals fill these positions. So the lack of a current performance improvements program, what could possibly be presented to an American man or woman that is highly qualified and certified for a position within the VA, whatever that position is, because veterans and Americans are done with the past performance of the VA. We demand reform, and this committee is committed to making it happen. So what possibly could an employee of the VA, having been highly trained and certified, regardless of position, why, if they're found to be negligent in their duties, why would they not be fired? What could they possibly learn from a 2 or 3 week performance improvement program that they didn't learn in 6 months or years of certification and training prior to being hired?
Well, sir, I think part of the issue is the VA constantly changes its performance standards trying to crank the machine up, particularly in VBA, that may not be a realistic machine to do that type of work.
May I
in a
submit
proper
to you, sir, that
mannerism,
every American man and woman viewing this hearing today is thinking to themselves, we bring our standards to work, man. There's no such thing as menial labor in my life. There's only menial men and women. It's impossible for a man or a woman of standards to perform a menial task because there's no such thing. There's only menial men and women. In your testimony, you have repeated the mantra that the current law is not working. May I suggest to you that management of the current law is what we need to address. Mr. Chairman,
time's expired.
I yield back.
Mr. Lamb, you're recognized.
Mr. Cox, could you maybe just explain in a little more detail some of the examples of how and why people are being fired in such large numbers since the implementation of this act? I mean, based on the information in your testimony and plenty of the other information we received, it's not so simple as an employee being found negligent in the care of a particular veteran, right? There are often other reasons that management is using to fire people.
That is correct, sir. Particularly in VBA, the benefits side, they've changed performance standards continuously. The answer is just speed up processing the claims faster, even though they're very complicated to process.
Right. And in fact, there are several examples detailed in your testimony where people have been fired after making whistleblower complaints, right?
Yes, sir. That happened in Phoenix and other places that our union had to come to the rescue.
And you yourself were a registered nurse at the VA for much of your career?
23 years, sir.
And during that time, did you have experience seeing other nurses or other employees in any job going through a performance improvement program?
Yes, sir, and many of them successfully completed it. I would say a high number of them successfully completed it because there was additional training, understanding the VA is a complex system, but it's still the best health care anyone can get in this country, and thank God that veterans are getting it.
Now, when you hear about a situation like ours in Pittsburgh where 46 lower-level employees have suffered adverse actions in the last year, and we have 300 vacancies. From your time at the VA, do you think that increases the day-to-day burden on the employees who are left, the ones who haven't been fired?
It certainly does, and it also jeopardizes the veterans, particularly if they're housekeeping aides. While people think of that as a very menial task, maybe, they're responsible for the cleaning and sanitizing of a hospital for infection control. It's one of the most important jobs in any medical center.
Are you in touch with some of the lower-level VA members who are left? And it's not the right term, lower level, but people who are filling in the RN, nursing assistant, food workers, cleaners. Are you in touch with them on a regular basis?
Yes, sir, I am.
How are they reacting to seeing in the last 6 months such a large number of people be fired at their level and such a small number of people be fired at the manager level?
There is fear. There is a lot of fear, and there's a feeling that floggings will continue until morale improves and everything is all better. And I think we all know that that's not the way that you get the best performance.
Do you think that helps them do their job to take care of the veterans any better?
I think no. I think it creates fear, and when you have fear in an organization, you never get the best performance, sir.
Yeah. Do you think it helps them do their job any better for there to be fewer employees around on a day, for there to be 46 fewer employees in Pittsburgh on top of the 300 vacancies?
No, sir. And obviously there needs to be sufficient employees to get the proper work done, because at the end of the day, without that being accomplished, the veteran suffers.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and being here with us until the end. Mr. Lamb, thank you for hanging in there. Thank you, Mr. Cox, once again for being here, and being no further questions. The second panel is dismissed, and I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Cano, any closing comments?
Just very briefly, I'm pleased to see that there are many in the majority who share the concerns of the minority about there being adequate whistleblower protection and how the OAWP is fulfilling or not fulfilling its role. I think people on both sides of the aisle are gravely concerned about this. I want to take note, a curious note, of the fact that I did ask Mr. Cox a question about how well the VA is making good on its professed statement that they are listening to employees. I note that they departed quite swiftly before Mr. Cox's testimony, and that's an indication of how they're listening to union officials and union members. I cannot see that their statements are very credible. I am troubled by the disappearance of performance improvement plans among rank and file employees at the VA, and the general. I can see how there could be very credible claims of a cultural fear within this organization. Fear that's pervasive, fear that issues from seeing large numbers of your fellow employees being fired without due process, without being able to tell your side of the story, does create a condition of fear and does depress morale. And I am very, very troubled by how I'm seeing the implementation of this Accountability Act go forward. Let me just say that there were claims, the one place of refuge that the acting secretary took was to say, well, we're firing about the same number of people. That's not really a great claim to stand on, because this law was intended to improve our ability, and we're talking about firings. We're talking about people who were removed and dismissed. We're not talking about just turnover in difficult jobs. And we're talking about veterans here. We're talking about a workforce that's been the most impacted. These are people who fought for our country. And I think we can do better. And I am just amazed at the implementation of this law. I had hoped it would be better. I am still cautiously optimistic with the right values at the top. We can get it right, but I question whether that is occurring now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And just to finish up, I think it was a very good hearing today. It's 1 year of the Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act. There obviously is a lot of work to be done to make sure that whistleblowers are protected, feel comfortable in coming out. And to Mr. Lamb's, I've been an employer. I was for over 30 years in private medical practice. And if you're short of personnel, you don't fire adequately performing employees. You reward those people to stay there. So I would say if I were a manager at Pittsburgh and I was having to get rid of somebody and I was already short of personnel, they'd have to do something pretty egregious for me to get rid of them. If you think about that, if you're already short of people. I know that the VA is having an issue with hiring people just like businesses across the country. I think we have a labor shortage in this country right now, and to compete for quality talent, VA has got to be a place that people want to work. And for the record, we get all hung up in numbers and all that, but while this discussion was going on, I had a chance to look at the June 1st, 2016 to June 22nd, 2017, before the Whistleblower Protection Act, and then after the Whistleblower Protection Act. And in the GS 1 through 6, the percentage of people terminated, and you have to look at it in percentage because the number of employees the VA has gone way up, is actually less. In the middle, the 7 through 10, the percent, as Mr. Cox had suggested, some of those people needed to be terminated. It did go up. And the GS 11 through 15, the percent went up. And the only percent that went down, and I think this is a reasonable thing to look at, are the SES and Title 38s. So here are the facts right here. I really appreciate everyone being here. I think there's a lot of work to be done. This committee is committed on a bipartisan basis to keep an eye on the VA. And I appreciate everyone's attendance today and being here. Hearing no more other comments, the meeting is adjourned.
you, sir.